Okay everyone, it's time to announce my favourite thing. A new type of British guy has just dropped. Well, okay, maybe not just dropped, but I've only been able to get around to recording regularly again recently. So let's just pretend for my benefit. So there's something that's been riling people up in the UK a little bit, and I, for the most part, only really commented on it in passing on my Twitch, which you should check out. But then I thought about it a little and decided maybe this would make a good casual video. You know, one of my lighter ones, which I have a bit of fun with. With that in mind, let me introduce you to the parliamentary wing of the new type of guy, who's really an old type of guy, but we'll kind of get to that. Nick Fletcher, MP for Don Valley, which is a former coal mining area in South Yorkshire near the very lovely city of Doncaster, which, if you Google and look it up, comes up with a very confused set of things that people were also Googling. Does Doncaster belong to Scotland? The answer is yes. Absolutely. Umzu Yusuf, I am demanding that you liberate the people of Doncaster from England at once. That'll look really stupid if he doesn't win the SNP leadership, so now he kind of has to save my blushes, I guess. Back to Nick Fletcher. It might surprise you all to know he's a Conservative, and that, like most Conservative MPs, he has some very legitimate and definitely not made up concerns about the issues facing British society today. Such as the fact that he voted against EU citizens already living in the UK having a right to remain in the UK, or voting against reducing tax avoidance, or voting against higher taxes on banks. Yeah. This is a guy who's got his priorities in order. So, when he stood to ask the leader of the House to schedule a debate, I was very keen to hear what he'd want the debate on. Maybe about how an imaginary Polish person was stealing from bankers to give to the poor. It turns out it was somehow more clownish than that, which is incredibly impressive, but here it is.
Nick Fletcher.
Madam Deputy Speaker, will the leader please set aside some time in this House for a debate on the international socialist concept of so-called 15-minute cities and 20-minute neighbourhoods? Ultra-low emission zones in their present form do untold economic damage to any city. However, the second step after these zones will take away personal freedoms as well. Sheffield is already on this journey, and I do not want Doncaster, which is also a Labour-run socialist council, to do the same. Low emission zones cost the taxpayer money, simple as. However, 15-minute cities will cost us our personal freedom, and that cannot be right.
There's a lot going on here, and for those of you out of the loop on some of the specific British stuff going on here, don't worry, we're going to go through that. Let's start with the idea of an international socialist concept. Now, that's a term that certainly feels loaded and reminds me of that time Tory MPs got together and decided to use the term cultural Marxist, and then when called out, only some of them decided that they'd never use it again. In this case, no eyes were batted at the language used in this particular unhinged speech. The other thing is, if this was an international socialist concept, you'd think that me, a person who was called cosmopolitan elite by a Tory, would have heard about it before a bunch of British people got their piss boiled about it. That's just to give you a sense of what type of views have parliamentary representation in Britain. Now I have to explain to you what an ultra-low emission zone is and what the point of it is. Those of you in Britain will remember something called the congestion charge, and the truth is that, as someone from outside of London, I haven't really got an idea of how it worked in practice. But it was basically a way to reduce the amount of traffic in London because, oh my god, have you ever tried driving in London? I mean, I haven't. I haven't got a driver's license or a car or any desire to have those things, but apparently it's bad. That's what I hear anyway. So, the ultra-low emission zone is the next step in that policy within a specific area of London. If you drive a car that doesn't meet certain emission standards, you have to pay a fee for driving it there. So not only is there a deterrent against driving in London, but now there's a targeted deterrent against certain vehicles. Whether or not it's caused economic damage, as that MP claimed, is possibly up for debate. as is whether on its own it's reducing the number of vehicles and levels of emissions from vehicles in those bits of the city, but I do think it's wild that an idea that was pioneered by Boris Johnson is now apparently setting the stage for international socialism. It's wild. Absolutely fucking wild. So, we've gone from low emission zones to 15-minute cities will cost us our personal freedom, which is a wild ride, right? And it needs so much more detail, but also, can I just applaud the guy for getting simple as into Hansard and saying it in Parliament? Just the perfect North FC vibe that we really needed in our legislative chamber. The thing is, it's actually wild that this kind of conspiracy-laden stuff is getting parliamentary representation. The 15-minute cities have essentially and exhaustingly become part of the culture war, to the point that we have this guy, possibly someone's dad or granddad, taking time out of his day to protest. What exactly? If this was a simple call for city planning to be more democratically accountable, I might not make a video about it. You know, I think that maybe it would be good if more aspects of society were democratically accountable, but people are out there really mad about it. And the things that they're saying are really out there, like wild conspiracy theory shit. These sorts of people, you know, they're the ones who love to tell you, do your own research. So you know what? I'm taking up the challenge of trying to figure out exactly what a 15-minute city is. Okay, it's time to do some of our own research, and from a quick, and I do mean quick look, here's what I've been able to work out about 15-minute cities. But just before we dive into it, I just want to say this is not intended to convince anyone who is a 15-minute city conspiracy person. Like, this is not going to convince you. I'm sorry. This video is not for you, it's about you. So do with this what you like. You can keep watching if you like, but it's not for you in that way. So what is it exactly? It's a city planning concept where the objective is to ensure all of the essential services that people need, like healthcare and food shopping and like cinemas and shit like that, is accessible via a 15-minute walk from any point in the city. And it's worth noting that as someone who lives in a pretty central part of a city, I kind of already have that for everything except like my GP and the hospital, and like it's pretty fucking good. I would say it's pretty nice. And the thing is that like various iterations of this concept have been around for a while. 20-minute cities predate the 15-minute city. There are also versions that focus on like walkable neighborhoods rather than thinking about it on the scale of a city. So, you know, those infamous 20-minute neighborhoods that MP was on about. But they really all boil down to make things more accessible through city planning, which doesn't really feel like socialism to me. I mean, it's not non-ideological, don't get me wrong, but it's an idea that can be pretty easily co-opted for various purposes. Even members of the hated Tory party have kind of looked at it and gone, well, there is something to pride in living locally, which, you know, for conservatives is a bit of a thread to pull on, so maybe we don't do that right now. A big part of the idea is to reduce dependence on cars. Now, I could go on and on and on about how personal car ownership has been a disaster, and yes, even if we all had electric cars, it would still be a disaster. The fact is that if you live in a city or a large town, you probably shouldn't need a car to do things. There is one iteration of the argument that the 15-minute conspiracy theorists, 15-minute conspiracy theorists, like they're mad at the concept of there being 15 minutes, but the 15-minute city conspiracy theorists make, that I'm not entirely unsympathetic to in a very, very particular British context. You see, I spend a lot of time on social media, as you do at my age, and I ran into an account that had all of the hallmarks of like a type of leftist account in Britain. You know, it's just guessing based on the aesthetics of the account. They are an older, whiter, left-wing person. And they were talking about this particular concept as if it was going to be all restrictions and no benefits. They got to that conclusion by talking about low traffic neighborhoods, which I will explain in a second, and they thought that low traffic neighborhoods were the thin wedge of the restrictions, and there was no intent to ever bring any of these positives and these services to these 15-minute cities. And the thing is, if you've lived in Britain in the past 45 years, I kinda can't blame you for that. You know, that's kind of been the vibe, as it were. I'll get into how low traffic neighborhoods factor into this specifically in a little while, but they are a slightly controversial traffic reduction policy whose aim is to limit traffic in specific local areas to residents and essential traffic, you know, like road maintenance and stuff like that. Basically, they're trying to force people to not cut through local neighborhoods in order to just reduce the amount of traffic and the amount of pollution in them. And there are potential issues here too, but based on the information we have, they largely seem to work relatively well, although there are questions about whether these have been placed in wealthier neighborhoods at the expense of poorer neighborhoods. Things to look into, right? But generally speaking, they do seem to reduce the amount of traffic, which, in the context of trying to reduce car usage, is probably a positive. The fact is that there are some criticisms of 15-minute cities that can be made, right? What guarantee do we have that we'll get those services? Which, I mean, we might be at a city planner's mercy in that case. How do we make sure that this policy doesn't gentrify neighborhoods or force people out that it intends to help? Ostensibly, this is a policy that's meant to help among various groups like disabled people, the elderly, and people who can't drive for whatever reason, and people who are on lower incomes. Do we have any guarantee that this doesn't lead to pushing those people out? I'm not so sure, right? On its own, as a planning principle, I'm skeptical that it'll do all of these things, right? But these concerns are at least in the realm of the actual material world that we live in, and at least they could be considered to be reasonably based in what the policy actually is. Which brings me on to this question. What are these people who are getting really mad about it to the point that they're protesting being told, and who's telling them these things? First of all, what these people are being told is connected with a range of live political issues that predate the actual concept of a 15-minute city. The guy who came up with it, Carlos Moreno, characterized the conspiracy theorists as like flat earthers, and while I can understand wanting to defend your ideas, I'd say this is much more closely aligned to climate change related conspiracy theories, because it's all bundled up with a whole range of ideas that are related in part to climate change, as well as fears about the World Economic Forum's Great Reset, which is the subject of many a deranged screed from certain people. In the UK, one of the recent protests against the 15-minute city concept happened in the city of Oxford. Now, as a person from Reading, I am obligated to hate Oxford in all of the ways, but know that this isn't petty regional bickering when I say Oxford is urgently in need of rescuing from cars. So what triggered this protest? Low traffic neighborhoods triggered it. Now, low traffic neighborhoods are quite controversial. There's quite a bit of culture war energy bound up in resisting them. In particular, there's a feeling that low traffic neighborhoods being spread to cities outside of London is part of some grand conspiracy to control people's movement. Which, on the surface, it is doing that, right? Like, it is saying that unless you have a particular residential permit or a particular reason to be in this area, you can't drive there. It's just that the jump from that, which you could argue about the effectiveness of, to the elite, in quotes, are going to force us to live in 15-minute walkable areas that we can't leave without scanning a QR code, and this will be enforced by like heavily armed police or the military, is huge. It's a huge leap. It's a huge leap. Like, astronomically huge. There is, as far as I can tell from reading about the concept, no intent for it to be enforced that way. So, like, don't worry, people who really tie up their personal identity in being able to drive. I think you can still do that under a 15-minute city. It's just that the things you need will be nearby. So you won't have to drive as much. You can still drive. It's fine. It's okay. Sorry, I know this is not meant to persuade the people who are losing their mind about it, but I just can't help but try there because it's so wild. And the thing is about it not being enforced in that way is I need people to pay attention to this part as well. It's a city planning concept. It's not like I really don't understand it. It's a bit like saying that because I made a walkable neighborhood in City Skylines that I'm Pol Pot. It doesn't make any fucking sense. There's a section of climate change denialism that posits that climate change is a hoax that is being pushed to force lifestyle changes onto people from above and make them easier to control. And there's a reason these kinds of conspiracy theories have blown up, and look, it's a bit beyond me to get into the technicals of it all, but let's just think about Britain and the world in recent years and just think a little bit about what might be driving this. So, 15-minute cities were endorsed by, among various entities, and by the way, various parts of the political spectrum, from like centre-right mayors to vaguely progressive Greens. They were endorsed by the World Economic Forum and the UN, which makes it a perfect candidate for culture war stuff. And when you think about Britain in the past few years, just think about all of the things that have been imposed on us, right? Think about, like, bailing out banks. That was imposed on us from above. You think about the restrictions imposed because of COVID. Now, you can think those were good, but they were imposed on us from above, and there wasn't really a terribly massive amounts of consultation going, though at the time lockdown did poll as the most popular government policy that had ever been polled at the time. So maybe a little bit of protesting doesn't make sense to me from some of these people. But anyway, think about all the other things that have been imposed on us from above. Fucking Tony Blair was imposed on us from above. Gordon Brown, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak, all these fucking terrible politicians have been imposed on us from above. And so we don't necessarily feel like we're in a terribly great amount of control of things. So maybe reaction makes a bit of sense in that context. But that's speculation on my part. That's just me having fun, right? So who's telling these people that their civil liberties are under threat? Because maybe they won't have to drive everywhere? I get that what they're actually telling them is that, like, you will never be able to drive ever. Which, like, to be fair, in cities and in large towns, I don't think you should need to own a car. I think there should be good public transport everywhere. But, you know, whatever. But who's telling them? I want everyone to sit down and get ready for this. Surprise! It's the worst people in the world. GB News is really pushing the panic. Tory MPs, as we've seen, are channeling it. And local political parties are really like fixating on being anti-low traffic neighborhood and therefore really kind of feeding into this stuff. And also far-right ghouls like Katie Hopkins, who, it's worth noting, once wrote a comment claiming refugees were like cockroaches, which might seem irrelevant until you realise the British government may have just legalised slavery based on the atmosphere that article was produced in. Yeah. Things have been happening in this country. But if I could sort of summarise what I want to say in this video at the end, don't listen to far-right ghouls. I know that there are people who are ostensibly on the left, because I mentioned one person who has the aesthetic of a left-wing account, a particular type of left-wing account, but a left-wing account nonetheless, who really seems to sincerely believe that this stuff is real. And I just need these people to look at who their allies are, because seriously, don't listen to fucking Katie Hopkins and GB News, for the love of Christ. I can't. How simple could it be? Anyway, this has been a bit of a shorter video from me, but I'm gonna go thank the patrons and everyone now. Okay, so that was a bit of a shorter video from me. I had a lot of fun doing a sort of quicker, more sort of fire from the hip video So it was good fun. But I want to say, if you enjoyed the video, remember to like and subscribe. I do keep forgetting to say that. And also I need to thank the top tier patrons, that is Drone Riff, John N, Kersley Shido, Mercutio, and SMD. Thank you especially to those people. If you want to get your name shouted out, it's the top tier on the Patreon. But if you want the videos a day early, if you want to see scripts early, if you want voting power on what videos I'm gonna do, or just really to keep up with what I'm doing and planning for the channel, the Patreon is the best place for it. So definitely make sure that you get onto that. Otherwise, you know, like, subscribe, share the video. That shit's all free. You don't have to pay me money to do that. And I will catch you all in the next one. Take it easy.